Jill Gentile. Hi, welcome. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the think tank on the resolution of intractable conflict that we're both on. But first, for our viewers, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Karen. Thank you. Thank
Hi.
you for the invitation. Well, as you know, I'm a psychoanalyst and a psychologist. I practice in New York and a bit out in New Jersey. I have for years now been interested in how psychoanalysis can be conceived as a theory and practice of democracy. And that way of thinking stemmed from working in my practice and being compelled by how relationships of hierarchy are dismantled through the process of psychoanalysis. And yet, how fierce the resistance to equality can be. And over time, I've come to see that as the main resistance in psychoanalysis, in psychoanalytic work and in democratic work. And for human beings, that we seem enormously threatened by and fearful of equality. So that has become an ongoing area of interest, tension, examination, dedication.
Yeah, I was thinking about your book, Feminine Law, and I love the equation or the connections between sort of free association and free speech. So psychoanalysis and democracy. And I'm sure that project is why Harriet invited you onto the think tank. Do you know?
I think so. I was already involved in a group that Chuck Sturzier was leading on psychoanalysis and history, and that was interrogating conflict. And when Harriet was putting her group together, she reached out to Chuck, and so it all kind of came together in that way. And so obviously there's some overlap between these two groups, and it's been, as you know, kind of an interesting, we sometimes get into our own intractable conflicts as we interrogate the world of intractable conflict. So the book was a big part of that emergent interest. I think that was the genesis of joining, I think, Chuck's group. And I may have told you the story. I began writing the book thinking I was going to write a short series of essays on the analogy between psychoanalysis and democracy. And it just took me over that once I began to study that analogy, starting with the relationship between free speech and free association, these practices of freedom that are fundamental rules, foundational to each practice. I became intrigued by what they shared. And it was not only a commitment to freedom, to a practice of freedom, but to a practice of the rule of law, to a law that conditions freedom. So that in each case, there's a tension between constraint and freedom, and something that we need to honor or surrender to in order to cultivate freedom. And it's that very same condition that seems to generate conditions of equality. And so then I began to explore how freedom and equality require each other, and that without conditions of equality, we can't have conditions of freedom. So all of that became extremely engaging for me. And since I published this book in 2016, and I thought I would move on, but there's no moving on. Like, there's, in so many ways, I keep being called back to these themes, unable to leave them behind, because now they condition my thinking about almost everything. So hence it's an ongoing preoccupation.
Well, but also I think you've added something to the psychoanalytic register, to psychoanalysis in the idea of the feminine, your idea of the
Mhm.
feminine in particular. Can you say a bit about that? Because that is an innovation, I think, in psychoanalysis, that idea of yours.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, well, the way I think about the feminine, it really, I was not consciously thinking about the feminine when I began to engage in this exploration. Um, but what I landed upon was this convergence in the literature around the limits of free association, and how the limits of free association seemed to meet up against naming the female body, the female sexual body, specifically the vaginal. Um, but there's all kinds of ways that the feminine is uh, degraded, erased, devalued in psychoanalytic thinking, and also, interestingly, privileged in certain ways, privileged as a sign of enigmas, a signifier of the uncanny. However, when we read Freud and Lacan, we discover that this signifier is intentionally, arguably missing. It's just not named. I mean, very quite intentionally in Lacan's discourse, it's an unnamed signifier. So, what is the purpose of something that remains unnamed for a field that is committed to consciousness, to the elaboration of consciousness, to the reclaiming of unconscious knowledge and wisdom and bringing it into the public realm, or into a form of knowing that is beyond repression and repudiation and disavowal. So all of that sort of intellectual migration seemed to dovetail with what democracies have been predicated upon, and part of, I mean, not only I, others have suggested, is the basis for the failure of democracy, that democracy has always been predicated on exclusions of slaves in ancient Greece and women, and most especially the surveillance of the female body. And so, and the racialized body. I mean, there's exclusions, and which so immediately from the outset spell the failure of democracy, because if democracy is thought of as a relationship of equals, of a collective enterprise, then how do we build a democracy when the what's legislated is that certain bodies and participants are excluded from equal rights, equal access, and from voice? So the fact that psychoanalysis was replicating these kinds of exclusions, even while we know that Freud's rule of free association was predicated on speaking the body, and quite specifically speaking the female body, because he trusted that the feminine was near to the repression barrier, that something about the feminine pointed towards repression, pointed towards truth, pointed towards trauma. And he founded his practice by listening to women whose symptoms spoke in lieu of their speech, right? They're in the treatment of hysteria. So, on the one hand, in that sense, the speaking female body had a lot of status, and on the other hand, it was it was exiled. So via Freud, we've inherited a contradictory legacy. And I think that fundamental contradiction at the heart of psychoanalytic theory, which is again replicated in democracies, is part of the rich legacy that Freud bequeathed to us that we need to disentangle. So I've come to think of psychoanalysis as a semiotic mystery tour. And all of that time, we're in search of the missing signifier. So the missing signifier, to the degree that it's missing, is productive for psychoanalysis because it fuels a search. It fuels an ongoing curiosity and quest for meaning and for bringing the invisible into the realm of the visible. And yet, to have the psychoanalytic consensus be that we're only going to name one signifier, the phallus, again, right, is a move that creates, in lieu of democracy, patriarchy. So how can a field that, again, is dedicated to unmasking hidden truths be simultaneously dedicated to silencing a truthful dimension of psychisoma,
Mhm.
a signifier, or by silencing this particular signifier? We can ask, why do we need these signifiers, the phallus and the vaginal? The phallus is so thoroughly written into psychoanalytic theory, and that's a broader conversation. But to the degree that we, as subjects, per the history of psychoanalysis, constitute our subjectivity in a phallic discourse, in relationship to a symbolic discourse that's grounded in the phallus, we then have to ask, well, what does that enlist subjects into? It enlists subjects into a lopsided symbolic discourse that's phallocratic, and one that already is dislocated from truth. Because as we read Freud, the origin story of the privileging of the phallus comes in the context of refusing, right, disavowing the sight, the knowledge, the naming of the feminine. So we see in contemporary society that we're living in a world where the question of truth is in serious disrepute. Like we no longer have a reliable consensus around truth. Maybe we never have, but it seems that in recent times this has become super problematic. Just reading the recent news around the hurricane in Tampa, in Florida, that there were so many alternative facts being circulating in the media around FEMA and FEMA's debunking, like purposefully feeding non-truths into the media, into the public realm, so that the public is completely confused about how reliable or valid the government's resources are to help people affected by the storm. It's just one example of so many. It's hard when you read stories like that to think, well, that has anything to do with the feminine. But my argument has been that at the bottom of all of that, our ease with disavowing truth and buying into false narratives is a form or conspiracy theory, links back to our early preference for castration fantasy, or turn to castration fantasy, because we have to do something with our erasure of the truth. And yet the truth never is completely silent. It always functions to disturb and disrupt our peace, which is part of why then we keep at it. We keep trying to erase and exile all the signs of disruption. I think we can have a more rigorous, robust public conversation if we decide maybe it doesn't serve us so much to refuse to name the signifier, because we've tried that for 100 years with psychoanalysis and for more than 100 years with democracy, depending on where you date its origin story. So maybe it's time to do something different. Maybe if we name this signifier, we help to constitute a gap in society, a gap that once named enables us to understand social unrest, to examine social unrest, because we now have the antagonism, the gap for that antagonism, without trying to mask it through polarization. So we have this contemporary problem of repetitive, rigid, polarizations everywhere. And people question, well, why do we keep recreating polarization? What's going on here? But if we're determined, right, or unconscious determinism, to exile the feminine and its uncanny effects, its interesting effects, its antagonizing effects, we create a different problem, because now we have the binary of polarization.
Right. And you're saying that the feminine signifier has to do with in-betweenness, has to do with this other space. It's a kind of thirdness. And without that, we're hopelessly binary, as you say, and split.
Yeah. And people have said to me, well, if you're so interested in signifying the feminine, doesn't that create a binary? Because now we have the phallus and the vagina, and just, but actually, I strongly feel that the feminine signifies the uncanny, signifies contradiction, signifies a space between, as you said, between what's accessible and inaccessible, between the enigmatic and what is knowable. And so it kind of repositions us to be continually at the forefront of new knowledge, of new possibility. And when we collapse that, we're left, what creates the binary is not the signifier of the feminine masculine, it's the absence of that, because then we are in the binary that Freud left us of having and not having. We either have the phallus or we don't have the phallus. There's no space between. So the feminine does some complicated work for us, which is why we need her, we need them, because I'm not interested in a dualism of feminine, masculine, gender-wise. I'm interested in a non-duality, that space between, which is why I think signifying the feminine is also super important for a genuinely trans-inclusive feminism. Without that, we have a trans that minus the feminine that does not serve trans, a transitional kind of gendered location. So it's a complicated argument, but I think that's the core of the thinking.
Well, yeah, I mean, in listening to you, it does feel like, well, yeah, if we could just do that, you know, we would sort things out. But of course, how do you do that, right? You think and you write and you talk and you are in groups and I mean, how do you do that?
It's a continual commitment. It requires, what's that famous quote? Was it by Jefferson or Jackson, Andrew Jackson maybe, that democracy requires eternal vigilance? And following the signage of the feminine requires eternal vigilance, because it's forever prone to erasure. And so in my practice clinically, I'm all the time listening for the erasure, challenging my patients, not so directly. It's pretty seldom that I'll say, hey, what just happened to the feminine there? Maybe I should start to do that. But I will, of course, a lot of the movement in relational psychoanalysis has been towards the notion of thirdness, of a space, a semiotic space between, a relational space between, a reflective space between. What I ask, at least when I'm teaching or doing clinical work supervision, is that people imagine what changes when they think of that thirdness as feminine, when they think of the third as a feminine third. How does that shift your orientation towards your clinical practice? With my patients, there will be some of that. It'll come in various ways. It may be by challenging the repetition in their narrative and always listening for markers of difference more than repetition. Because again, for Freud, the original sign of difference of the uncanny was the feminine, was the female body, was the maternal body, the maternal sexed body. So we want to disrupt patriarchal hegemony. It doesn't serve psychoanalysis and it doesn't serve democracy. And whether we think of that as whiteness or a masculinist discourse, they're all dedicated to the reproduction of the same, the reproduction of the white masculinist privilege. This is a time, we know we're living in a time on the planet where we're speaking about intractable conflict, that disrupting the status quo, it has to be a huge part of disrupting intractable conflict. And that means conceiving of creating inclusive spaces no matter where we are. And so that may be in the clinic, that may be in the society at large. And partly I do think that explicitly naming spaces, feminine spaces, explicitly or highlighting the names of marginalized peoples, indigenous bodies, that we start to reclaim a social space that's more radically and genuinely inclusive. So we begin that way. That's one way, amongst other ways.
Yeah, I mean, you're saying something like, here's what I'm hearing, something like the exile of the feminine, of that particular kind of thirdness and ability to kind of observe, right? Because you need space to observe. The exile of the feminine, it's like the original conspiracy theory. So that we're all living in this sort of conspiracy. And then, of course, subject to conspiracy theories as a result. That's like one of the symptoms of the exile. And then what do you get? You get tyrants, you get autocracy, you get, yeah.
And autocracy becomes interested in surveilling the feminine more and more and more. So we see all these abortion laws, and we see all of these efforts to ban and surveil migrants and feminized bodies. And so the discourse becomes very predictable, and we see the increased lack of a foothold in the realm of truth. So all of these are correlated. They're not coincidences. They're overdetermined correlations because they're all of one piece. And what we're experiencing now, I think, is this upping the ante of this dynamic. It's just in the most emboldened and over the top fashion right now that we're witnessing between the climate crisis, which becomes that assault on Mother Earth. And again, I ask for a non-dual representation of Mother Earth, but the maternal function, what does it mean that we are destroying the conditions for our survival? And will we dare to evolve our consciousness in time to do something differently? And the degradation of the rule of law becomes foundational to the resurrection of our planet and our democracy. Sadly, people dedicated to autocracy know this, and that's why there's such a vengeance for dismantling the rule of law. So we're in a fierce battle right now, and if the original conspiracy is related to the exile of the feminine, we may hope that the feminine as a force, as a dynamic force, as a more than human force may come to help rescue us. I have a new paper out looking at, it's a short essay looking at the relationship between Winnicott's essay on breakdown, fear of breakdown, and his object use essay, in which, but speaking to a larger audience, Winnicott, one of our premier theorists of space, and I would say of the feminine, and certainly of play, and actually of democracy, was interested in this notion that we are a destructive species, but our destruction is tied to our discovery of otherness, of love, that it's not destruction in and of its own right, that we bring our destruction to bear, most especially on our maternal figures, so that we might come to know the maternal as a subject in her own right. And I've wondered if we need to destroy the planet in order to discover the subjectivity of the planet's aliveness, that we're kind of collectively enlisted on this project to destroy. So for the sake of our survival, most of us put the spin on it that we're just destroying our planet. But if we follow the trajectory that Winnicott sets forth, our destruction becomes increasingly intense. He uses the term maximal destruction for the sake of survival and discovery of otherness. So we may be on the precipice of not only of destroying ourselves and our species and our planet, but on a new form of collective survival, discovery. Interestingly, in that context, that Kamala Harris's campaign uses the terminology of joy, of a commitment to joy, because it's a term that Winnicott uses on the other side of the destruction, right? The joyful discovery of otherness, of life. But Winnicott also, in a separate essay in his breakdown essay, describes our breakdown fears, that we fear breakdown, and we need breakdown, at least those of us with a traumatic history. And who amongst us living on the planet today does not have a traumatic history? Because we're all implicated in the traumas of the origin story of our planet, of our country, and currently in the Middle East and elsewhere. So if we are on the verge of collective breakdown, we're also on the brink of collective discovery or collective encounter with repudiated trauma, including collective trauma, ancestral trauma. So I think of these two papers, although they're not usually discussed together, as belonging together. And that what does it mean to contemplate that all of the intractable conflict in the world is fast accelerating towards these moments that go together, if commonly seen distinctly, and that we're really on the precipice of breakdown times that are also times of potential new survival, profound reckoning with that ancestral trauma, as well as new discovery of otherness between ourselves, and between ourselves as a species and the non-human world. I've become interested in the realm of plant medicine and psychedelics, and why
Yeah.
now, and the interest in accelerating global consciousness through the spirit realm that the plants offer has become a point of fascination for me, in part because I think the timing of it is fascinating. That
Yeah,
it's
I want to talk to you about this because so tell me you're talking about psilocybin. Yes. Are you talking about mushrooms? Are you talking about ayahuasca? Are you talking about MDMA, ketamine?
um I think of them collectively, but most especially it's collectively, albeit with some differences, because obviously ketamine is the only psychedelic that's available for legal use in clinical work as a psychologist or as a practitioner. Um, and ketamine is primarily, from my understanding, a pharmaceutically created chemical kind of that produces these effects. Although I've lately discovered that I think the key molecule in ketamine, which enables the psychedelic effects, is found in the mushroom. So it has its own natural world sourcing. Um, that said, I'm hardly an expert on all of this, but I have some thoughts about it, which is that ayahuasca and a host of other psychedelics that are brewed and grown and brewed and used in traditional indigenous cultures and shamanistic cultures, and that have now found their way into North America and Europe and elsewhere, have a strong spiritual dimension, and that the psychedelic opens up to the realm of the spiritual. And that's true with mushrooms as well. And I think it's true with all of these medicines, though maybe that element of plant consciousness is not as acute in ketamine or MDMA, because they're not grown in the ground and organically. They're not plants. They're not plants or or fungi. So I think within the sacred plant world, there's a sense that the plants are calling humans, and intervening on behalf of humans, because humans have on our own, sadly, been quite destructive and need the intervention of the plant world, which has evolved for thousands and thousands of years, and hold incredible wisdom for humanity, and have the generosity to intervene in our lives now in a way to enrich us, to help us at a time of crisis, spiritual and ecological and political crisis. So if we understand them as really quite dramatically intervening, because it's in the last 5 years or so that the explosion of interest has really happened in North America anyway, that if we interpret their timing as a very skillful clinical intervention, we I think surrendering to that intervention is not is worth considering. It may not be right for everyone, but
It's an intervention maybe of the feminine, right?
thank you.
And I think too, I was thinking because, there's disinhibition, there's a connection to another, sort of plane, but there's disinhibition and often relaxed, an ability to free associate that comes, like stuff comes right up out of the unconscious.
And
Mhm.
add so much ancestral healing that's trapped in the body that psychoanalysis traditionally has had such a challenge with. Although it was founded upon listening to the body, we know that the body holds stories and secrets that often bypass analytic work for long periods of time, if not forever. So thank you for saying that. It's very perceptive that the quality of free association predicated on the somatic and on the body and often on the sexual body is enabled through the practice of psychedelics. And many of the psychedelics, not exclusively, are seen within traditional lineages as holding feminine energy. We think of ayahuasca as grandmother. We think of Jurema as the great aunt. That we have different ways of referencing the feminine spirit of a plant. And certainly the masculine plants, which are understood as divine, carrying divine masculine energy, are also here to help redeem this very uh, atrophied phallocratic culture. I mean,
Mm.
atrophied and trumped up at the same time.
Yeah, right.
Had
Yeah,
people.
I just think, a lot of the I do equine therapy,
Mm,
or I'm learning it. I don't do it. I'm learning it, and I bring my patients over to my friend who does equine therapy and has for many years, and her training is indigenous equine therapy. Like that's where it stems from. So the directions and many other parts of the work that the training that she's done, the thinking that she's steeped in has to do with indigenous traditions. And there's something about the work with the horses that allows patients and me working with them to access stuff that
mm.
we just can't in talk therapy. You
But
get to, or maybe you could after 7 or 8 years, but something happens, something embodied is able to happen with the horses, that's very ancient.
does she talk about the feminine in any way, or have you come to see a linkage there? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much talk, but yes, I feel like the feminine is just a part of
Mhm.
what we do. It's three women
Mm,
every Monday
mhm,
being with
mm,
one or more of the horses in some way, connecting with them,
mhm,
um, communicating with them, letting them help us get to a truth or
mhm.
a knowing or an emotion. The first time I did it, I had two feelings that were separated, and the horse came and just sort of like honked me, and they connected, and there was a release of grief. I thought,
I
oh,
mean,
okay. Yeah,
so
and
beautiful.
that was about my mom. And so it's it
Brilliant.
is feminine because
Well,
you
it's
it
also to your point about free association. It's free association is ultimately a practice of surrender. And to my very, very limited experience being on a horse, there's no way but to surrender. And certainly with psychedelics, but to surrender. And it's only in that pathway of surrender that we find our healing and begin to find our truth, our voice, for the truth of our story, for what has not yet, what we've so far disavowed or remained, in our loyalties to those we love or fear, or both, have
mm,
against our own.
I I remember you were mentioning the use of, and I don't know if this was a proposal or aspirational, or if it had actually happened, where it was perhaps people, sort of Israel, Gaza, transgenerational trauma, generations of othering and hatred, doing some psychedelic gathering. What was
Yeah,
the story? Can you tell
I
that?
had been at the Horizon Psychedelic Conference, and I wish I could remember the names of the researchers that presented this work. They had held, I don't want to misquote, but my memory, which is far from perfect, they had done some ayahuasca, I believe it was all with ayahuasca, work between Palestinians and Israelis, and described the outcome of, I think they had done a pilot project, which then they were going to continue, and had discovered that initially there was a great deal of fear and mistrust bringing these two groups together, asking them to surrender, right? They by participating in an ayahuasca journey together, and described the energy initially as quite chaotic upon once they had consumed the tea, and challenging to navigate. And what they described was that through the journey was the sense of ancestors on both sides, both both peoples needing to contend with their own ancestry, their own the needs for their ancestry to find peace, so that there was a call for that, for deep grieving work, and some shift in the energy around, are we still living enslaved to what we believe that our ancestors require, being identified with their mission, rather than letting them heal and be liberated from that burden, and so that we too might be liberated. I may be overly interpreting what they said based on my own memory or my own interpretation, but I do know that through this process, the groups came to a place of quite a bit of trust, and joy might be too strong of a word, but certainly a quality of love, peacefulness, and trust that I believe emerged. I would love to track this down. I went to the website, and there must be a way to track it down, but it wasn't listed in some obvious way, so I could see it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so that's about kind of a mutual recognition, like a removal of the binary. Do you know, it's not really about depressive position. That's something else entirely, right? But it's definitely a removal of the splitting of the binary.
Yeah, by means of a pathway of recognition and grieving, and not disavowing, not allowing history to be history, right? Because we're so loyal to our ancestors that we keep reproducing something, even if that means we can never heal. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack in this.
I feel like talking about it forever, but we'll have to find that and then think about it and talk about it more, because I think that's a kind of radical intervention that actually feels more doable or possible than a lot of things that are proposed for the resolution of intractable conflict, which involves a lot of wishful thinking, I think, and a lot of talking when, sometimes we're beyond talk. There is no talking.
Well, and the brilliance of these plants is they guide the intervention. Their wisdom is beyond ours, and that not that we don't get to intervene in the conversation in some way, but that their interest is a genuine kind of healing that is both personal, profoundly personal, based on whatever your story is or mine or someone else's, and at the same time collective, and absolutely organized towards expanding consciousness. So it's a really liberatory, liberatory, there's liberatory potential. And I think it's very hard to come away from that kind of work without a greater recognition and respect for our neighbor, including those neighbors we want to disavow, our collective neighbors. And what a wonderful gift it would be to the Middle East right now, to the world, for all political leaders to be willing to participate in something like this.
Mm.
And yeah,
Hmm.
we're a distance from that, but that would be a dream. Yeah.
Yeah, so interesting. Well, okay, well, what if we talked about a lot? You know, not just a lot of things, but a lot of important things. And I love how you're taking your experience from the clinic, like the micro of the clinic, the two people in a room with the third, and extrapolating that out to
Well, it's
society, to governance, to freedom, to, yeah.
it's the best, for me, it's also a way of checking my own thinking. If I haven't experienced it in practice, the intractable conflict between patient and analyst or within the patient themselves around, and how we begin to move beyond that to spaces of collective freedom between the two of us in the room together, and for my person that I'm working with, for them in their psyche and in their lives, then I don't know that there's anything real to say. Then it's just all abstract theory. But if it's grounded in the actual momentum and clinical process of clinical transformation, I think we can analogize from there to the world beyond. And I know there's some, in our own group, there's some disagreement on that point. I strongly, though, feel like that it's a quite valid basis, because we see so intimately how we our species work to undermine our freedom, and how we can actually, through our speech and our way of being together, can evolve to
Yes.
ethical inclusive practices.
Yes, pushing through the fear of freedom and all of its burdens and all of its vicissitudes and so on. Yeah,
You
that's
can
the
never
word.
have exempt from the fear of the feminine. So we're always like circling these dynamics and need to be alert to them. But yeah, I know, great. I'm so grateful for your conversation and interest and enthusiasm. And I would love to get up to Canada and do some of that work with your horses one day.
Yeah.
Sounds so beautiful. And
You are welcome. You are always welcome. Well, thanks so much, Jill. And I'm going to see you soon at our next think tank meeting, I'm sure. So take good care of yourself, and I'd like to see what you're writing as well. Maybe you could send that and we can link to it.
thank you,
Uh,
Karen. Take care
Thanks.
and much
Take good
appreciated.
care.